This video is sponsored by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for building a professional online presence that helps you run your business. More on them at the end of the video. I was playing Dark Souls Remastered recently, and do you know what was my overriding feeling while playing it? Something along the lines of, wow, this game is pretty terrible. It's really not, and it's actually a hugely impressive game amongst a series of games that regularly find the perfect balance between crushing difficulty and unbelievable satisfaction when you eventually overcome those odds. But my recent playthrough of Dark Souls helped to highlight some of the more egregious bumps in the road. Sometimes it's a dragon dumping fire on you without warning, and sometimes it's a cheap, disappointing boss battle. Some of the fights in this game are absolute classics of the genre and the series as a whole, whereas others are different. Except different here means bad. And naturally, the logical line of thinking is to look over the entire franchise and pick out some other examples of terrible boss fights that don't fall into the beautiful template of challenging, but enjoyable, because this can be hard to achieve with different enemy types and locations and scenarios. But man, when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. I haven't got the time or care to tally up just how many bosses there are in the whole franchise, but I think it's reasonable that there's a few bad eggs among a sea of very fun boss fights. The problem is that while each and every Soulsborne game is full of cool ideas and really exciting boss fights, there's always a moment or two or even whole levels that drop the ball and let it trickle off the edge of the world and into a disturbing alternate reality where FromSoftware don't know what they're doing. They've got years of experience at doing this at this point, but that doesn't mean that it's been a smooth ride all the way and that every boss in these games is a 10 out of 10 from start to finish. Can't have highlights without examples of just how bad life can get for you. I hesitated a lot about whether or not to include Sekiro in this video. Part of me really wanted to, because that way we'd have representatives from every corner of FromSoftware's 10-year adventure with this series, but it's also a massive departure from anything we've seen before with these games. You're not hacking away at a giant monster, it's more about positioning and exploiting openings so that you can land that one killing blow and finish an opponent in style. A lot of fights lead into this idea very well, so choosing a worst fight in Sekiro is a lot harder than you think. There's some bosses that are stronger variants of enemies that you've already encountered and conquered, and those folding screen monkeys are like an unfinished version of the end from Metal Gear Solid 3, but the actual worst boss can be found chilling out in the middle of a clearing, being absolutely furious about anyone being around. It's good to get the practice in when no one else is watching. The Demon of Hatred is a very strange beast and one that I don't really hate. All this time, Sekiro's been teaching you to play in a certain way and to duel your opponents on a fairly level playing field, while using all of the new mechanics that are unique to Sekiro's style of combat. This guy throws it all out of the window for what I'm going to call a slightly above average Bloodborne boss, mixed with the punishing difficulty of some of the harsher Dark Souls bosses. The Demon of Hatred jumps around a lot and does massive damage from afar, so it's in your best interest to close the gap with your grappling hook and hack him up from as close as you can manage, but even with 3 separate stages, he never gets more interesting and more creative than attacking and dodging when he telegraphs a powerful attack. I feel a little bad putting him on here because all of this would be fine in any other Soulsborne game, but when Sekiro is capable of so much more and has shown that before, the Demon of Hatred can't help but feel like a letdown. He's almost accidentally one of the hardest boss fights in all of Sekiro. That's because he's in the wrong game. I'm undecided as to which one of these games is the best, but I can say with a fair amount of confidence that Bloodborne is my favourite. It's a lot less tactical than anything that Dark Souls can offer you, and it does ultimately boil down to a lot of aggressive slashing of anything of a pulse, but a lot of boss fights in this game work with this style of combat to create some incredible fights, and it's an incredible package overall. Or you could just run around a library and hit a guy a few times before he runs away. That's what I want in my video game. I'm not totally against alternate approaches to boss fights. Some of my favourite fights from other games are what you might call unconventional, but even when they change up a lot of important features, they retain the core idea of what a boss fight from this franchise should be. Soulsborne has had quite a lot of variety to the point where nailing down what a quintessential battle looks like is surprisingly tricky to do. That being said, I don't think many people would look at Mikolash, host of the Nightmare from Bloodborne, darting from one room to the next and generally running away from you whenever possible, and say this is what Soulsborne should look like. It is a far cry from all of those larger-than-life battles against giant demons, and I'm not saying that they all have to look like this, but I wish they didn't look like this. The previous boss fight before this was a long overdue confrontation with one of those giant nightmare monsters with exactly too many arms that are part of a group of boss fights against the equivalent of gods in this world, and while I do love me some variety, Mikolash can't help but feel like a step down. Even if you know what you're doing, it's a long fight as you scarper after this birdcage-headed fuck, and it quickly becomes a long drawn-out fight as you catch up to Mikolash initially, whack him a bunch of times, only for him to leave for a new location, which means more running and more not fighting the actual boss. Even when you do get to fight him, Mikolash simultaneously has a weak set of moves that aren't much of a threat at all. One of his attacks is literally called Punch, but he also casts a Call Beyond, which will do massive damage and maybe kill you if you don't know the specific way of avoiding this barrage of attacks. The problem is that this kind of cat and mouse game kinda fits Mikolash's character really well, and is well designed in that aspect, but it's just not a lot of fun to chase after him all the time. Love the headwear though, it's very stylish. A huge part of any boss fight in this franchise is the place you fight them. That might sound painfully obvious, but you can place any of the best boss fights in this franchise in a cramped hallway, and all of a sudden it's not such a great experience anymore. Imagine if you fought Father Gascoigne in a tiny area, or found Ornstein and Smaug chilling out in a cupboard. You would probably have a really hard time keeping your distance and having any kind of fun. The Capra Demon in isolation is far from a terrible boss. If anything, it's an exciting shift of direction where you've previously fought a bunch of giant monsters in large areas that give you plenty of room to maneuver around them, but now you have to stay on your toes even more so that you're not backing yourself into a corner and leaving Capra Demon with a clean shot at your squishy bits. Great learning experience, guys. Let's move on to the next one. Oh, you want to add some dogs as well? Why would you do that? I want to like this boss for being different and for forcing me to change up how I approach one-on-one fights, but adding dogs that only serve to mess up your rhythm is such a cheap move. Dark Souls in basically any iteration struggles whenever you have to fight more than one enemy at a time, but especially when they're different enemies that move and attack at different speeds. As soon as you enter through the fog door, your character model blocks most of the Capra Demon, as he lurches towards you and likely strikes you down before you can react. Even if you can react and block his first strike, the leaves in the foreground will hide both you and the Capra Demon and his doggo friends, so it's hard to see what anyone is doing and a very janky experience in edging up the stairs so you can see what's happening in this boss fight. The dogs are basically the main component of this fight, because once they're dead, the Capra Demon is a whole lot more manageable. But this feels like a massive wasted opportunity where a larger arena could have paved the way for a much more satisfying boss fight. Instead, he'll likely kill you very quickly until you learn what to do, which is something I never like to see in these fights. Just a little bit of respect goes a long way. I hope you don't think I've forgotten about Demon Souls. I wouldn't blame you, because I often do, and society at large tends to think that Soulsborne started in 2011 with Dark Souls, but overlooking Demon Souls would be a great disservice of the game that started all of this off. It's held up surprisingly well, all things considered, minus the now defunct servers, and you can still find some incredible series highlights in there. The Tower Knight is practically the template that all large bosses read from in future games, but those highlights wouldn't stand out if there weren't some equally cavernous low points. It's no surprise that Demon Souls has more than a few of these, considering it was still finding its feet and trying out a whole host of new ideas to see what worked and what really didn't. I don't think I have to argue too hard that the Leechmonger didn't work, because it's a large mass of leeches that is bound to a pool of crap in the middle of the arena, which means it can't move. I'm sure this will be really hard. That got me thinking how many Soulsborne bosses are anchored to one spot and can't move, and there really aren't all that many. I think it's got something to do with how intimidating it can be for a boss of any size to be moving towards the player and putting you onto the back foot. You know, like the Leechmonger stands still and can't move, which means the player has to choose the speed of engagement, and that does change a lot of how the boss fight feels. Mainly for the negative. Especially since Leechmonger is a much bigger threat at range than close up. You could always fight it at range, which is very plausible since the bow will make relatively quick work of it, but this boss really wants you to close the distance and get in amongst its nastiness in order to defeat it without breaking a sweat. Once you're down there, there's not a lot here for you to be afraid of, unless you're deathly scared of leeches, since Leechmonger has a couple of attacks that are massively telegraphed and easily dodged, so you can quickly go back to hacking lumps out of this quivering mass of goo in just a couple of minutes. Demon Souls especially is really creative with boss designs and setups, so it's a little jarring to have something so bland and simple at the end of the 5th area in the game. Someone didn't think this one through enough. When Soulsborne gets wild, it gets really wild. Given how crazy the lore is with a lot of these games, it's probably not such a stretch that so many bosses are designed with incredibly abstract appearances and backstories, and attempting to understand exactly what you're fighting and how it relates back to the story that you've been clinging on to out of some obligation for appropriate context is the one battle that you're not likely to win in these games. Bloodborne especially gets trippy as all hell as you start fighting corrupted hunters that turn into terrifying monsters, or giant spider gods, or the absolute sight that is the One Reborn. What I'm told is an attempt at a ritual for resurrecting something, but definitely just looks like a mass of decaying corpses clumped together for the most visually challenging boss design in the game. Given the tone of Bloodborne, the One Reborn is the perfect blend of gut-wrenchingly disgusting in an oddly beautiful setting with the orange moon drenching the whole area in a haunting glow. Not saying that this is beautiful, but it's almost mesmerizing. So yeah, juicy corpses are mesmerizing, moving on. Fighting the One Reborn is not as fun as you would have hoped though. I mean, maybe expectations are low because of all of those flailing limbs, and they're probably going to be a problem, since it's hard to get a grasp on this boss's true form. It's like Gygus all over again, but being a little confused isn't as much of a problem as this fight's inability to have a fun middle ground. By that I mean you can make this fight a piece of cake if you take out the 6 casters on the walkway surrounding the One Reborn, leaving you to spam attacks until it falls apart, but if you leave them alone there's too much to deal with, and the fight ends up feeling cheap and too hectic for its own good. It's a surprisingly simple boss for such a creatively gross design, and I think that's what lets me down the most of all of this. Maybe it could break apart and they'd all rush me down at once and maybe reform with whatever's left. I've just described Jalhalla from Wind Waker, haven't I? It doesn't help either that it's very easy to be over-leveled for this fight and to beat the One Reborn even faster than usual. Well, it wasn't reborn for long. Soulsborne games are a little unique when it comes to complaining about crappy boss fights. Usually by this point I'd feel the need to mention a boss that kicked the crap out of me through using a series of cheap attacks that weren't telegraphed properly, and there's definitely a lot of fights like this in this franchise, but they don't leave me feeling half as angry as I would usually. Trust me, I don't enjoy needing to reevaluate my skills at these games when a boss in the DLC makes me look like I just started playing 10 minutes ago, but the ultimate payoff of beating something like the Orphan of Kos is worth it so goddamn much. Beating something like Pinwheel though is over in about 30 seconds and makes me feel nothing inside. Bit of a difference, I know. I keep thinking that Pinwheel has to be a joke boss within the context of what Dark Souls is as a game and a cultural phenomenon. There simply can't be a boss in this game that you walk up to and hit a few times and watch it crumple to the ground, having barely put up a fight, because I have so many memories of struggling at various points of this game, and these two ideas are surely incompatible. Pinwheel spends too much time teleporting around the room and making copies of himself than he does attacking, and even then the attacks he throws out barely do any damage and can be quickly overwhelmed by your own. I'm fairly certain I've had more trouble with regular enemies that know how to guard and dodge attacks than I've had with one of the main bosses in a Dark Souls game. I think you spend more time watching the intro to the fight than you do fighting Pinwheel. It's like a parallel universe. Fighting a dragon is a big fucking deal in these games. Of all the gigantic mythological creatures out there, dragons have this presence about them that evokes some primal response in our brains. They're like flying dinosaurs, so obviously in a game about killing powerful foes, they represent the creme de la creme of power fantasies and overcoming ridiculously steep odds to tackle one to the ground. FromSoftware knows this, which is why they saved the best dragons for the DLC, because nothing says "holy shit" by me more than the promise of a good boss fight with an imposing dragon. The reverse side of the same coin is the ancient Wyvern from Dark Souls 3, who sweeps into view without fanfare to tower over you as the dramatic choir comes in as you helplessly run away while feeling the heat of its fire on your back. Awesome setup that gives you that incredible feeling of, oh no, as the ancient Wyvern fills up the area ahead and you're left wondering what to do. You might even get an attack off, which will give you a hint that all is not well here when it does next to no damage. Oh, how I wish you could fight it normally. But no, in another case of let's try something different that ends up being a bad thing, the ancient Wyvern cannot be fought directly. Instead, running past it is indeed the right thing to do, and you're going to keep running and fighting your way through hordes of annoying enemies and avoiding the occasional fireball from old dragon over there in order to reach this one specific point above his head here. One plunging attack later that snaps you into a custom animation and the ancient Wyvern loses all of its health in one go. I can't tell you how far my heart sank through the floor when this happened, because everything leading up to this was pretty entertaining. If this had started the fight for real and you could fight this dragon as normal, then I think it would have worked really well, but as it is, the ancient Wyvern is lacking the one thing that every good Soulsborne fight has: a sense of satisfaction. I don't feel satisfied with killing it in one hit and barely even fighting it. I feel like I've cheesed it even when I haven't. No boss fight should have you questioning if it deserves that title. Do you know maybe the single worst trait a boss fight can have? Boring. Arguably the one thing you don't want a boss to be is boring. Since to feel anger and injustice is one thing, but to feel nothing? That is disappointment in its truest form, and I don't think I felt nothing in quite the same way with this franchise as when I fought and beat the Covidous Demon from Dark Souls 2 for the first time. Massive emphasis on first time, since dying to this Jabba the Hutt looking bastard is actually a challenge in of itself. Not as much as Pinwheel, but no one dies to Pinwheel, unless you're trying way too hard. I don't really know what to say about the Covetous Demon, but you can really tell that no time or effort was put towards him. His uninspiring design is one thing that I can get over fairly quickly, but he carries no threat at all, and is comfortably one of the easiest fights in the series. Pinwheel, I suppose, is easier, but at least he has a few interesting mechanics that it fails to make the most of. Covetous Demon just pivots in a circle without attacking you, or maybe sometimes lifting its body or tail in a blatantly obvious way so that you know an attack is coming and that you can just back up a few inches. Other than that, you can just circle straight from into oblivion since he turns so slowly, and you'll likely come out of this fight with barely any scratches on you at all. I just don't get the point of this. At least he's got a good name, although I'm not sure what he's covetous of. Probably some interesting attacks. It is strange how bosses like Pinwheel and Covetous Demon exist after the opening stages of the game. The first boss fight of any Soulsborne game is a really tough gig because it has to strike the perfect balance of difficulty. If it's too easy, the player will have the completely wrong impression of what's to come later. But then, why are there easier bosses later in the game? Are we expecting players to become complacent? Or they need a pick-me-up after some morally crushing defeats earlier? You could at least make them interesting. Dark Souls 2 had a lot of bosses in it. Maybe that's just a symptom of sequelitis and needing the sequel to feel bigger and more impressive, and the only way of doing this is having the best part of 40 bosses instead of a much more reasonable 26 like in Dark Souls 1. The natural problem that comes of this is that there's a massive disparity in quality, and while you might enjoy the wonderfully atmospheric bout with Looking Glass Knight, with lashes of rain and thunder reflecting off his shiny armor, there's also 2 fights against rats in this game. One of which has you stab a giant rat to death, and one where you fight a legion of them where you only need to kill the leader. So, that's a simple choice. I often wake up in the middle of the night questioning if Royal Rat Vanguard deserves to be considered a boss fight. At the end of the day, the boss in question has slightly more health than a standard rat enemy, and will likely be defeated before you have a chance to really take in what's happening here, but the leader rat does come with a health bar, even if it does deplete alarmingly fast. The difficulty, of which there isn't a lot, comes from dealing with a pack of dangerous enemies where things can get out of hand very quickly, but you can also just run through them in pursuit of the leader, which greatly dilutes the challenge. There is something hilarious about how the rest of the rats run away once you've killed the head rat, and to me, it symbolizes how pointless they were as a concept. It's like a Mario boss where there's 99 Goombas and one slightly more important Goomba. I could definitely spend my time better. I keep looking for a through line with the bosses in this video. I've covered 6 different games and a whole host of differently terrible boss fights, and the only consistency I can see is that most of them are a little too easy. Not just easy though, easy in such a way that feels pointless and or a waste of the time I could have spent learning how to fight a boss that would have given me a bit of satisfaction when beating it. If that's the case, then Bed of Chaos is the main outlier here, because if there's one thing you can't say about this monstrosity, it'd be that I wish FromSoftware made it more difficult to defeat. Oh boy, I wish they made its attacks more random, or made it knock me into more holes. Is that too much to ask for? Bed of Chaos is comfortably the worst Soulsborne boss because it abandoned so many conventions of the genre for its own set of bullshit rules. For one, you can't attack it directly, and instead need to travel to destroy special routes either side of it, so you can open up and destroy its vulnerable core. But doing so causes the floor to crumble away and Bed of Chaos to start swiping you into those holes. Luckily, once you've destroyed each route, your progress is saved even if you die. But then we get to another major problem: platforming in a Dark Souls game! Kinda self-explanatory, but you're required to make a jump onto this sloped log, and I've slid off of this thing more times than I can count. That is, if I haven't got past this impenetrable wall of flailing appendages. I've played and replayed Dark Souls 1 multiple times, and no matter how good I get, Bed of Chaos always finds new and cheaper ways of killing me, and I absolutely hate it for that. Chaos is the right word to use. This is RabbidLuigi, and the final nail in the coffin and the ultimate gut punch is the fact that the Bed of Chaos is considered a puzzle boss, because you're not interacting much with it directly, and you need to work out what you need to do with the environment in order to beat it. Puzzle boss doesn't seem like the right description though, because I know what I need to do. It's doing the thing that's the hard thing. Just burn it to the fucking ground already. Maybe you have your own opinions about Soulsborne boss fights, in which case you need your own platform to express those views. If you use YouTube, you'll have to fight some of these terrible fights again, so it's better if you make a website with Squarespace instead. Especially since Squarespace is perfectly suited to help novices create beautiful websites with ease. They've got a wide range of designs to choose from and intuitive tools to help you build a website that you can be proud of. I'm still working on my review site, but I'm really happy with what I've been able to make, with what I have available to me as part of my Squarespace membership. Plus, if I don't understand how to do something or can't quite work out what I want, I can always look at the huge number of on-site tutorials that make it nice and easy for me to learn. So if you're ready to share your passion or just your opinion with the world with a service that is willing to help you every step of the way, head on over to squarespace.com for a 14-day free trial, and when you're ready to get going for real, go to squarespace.com/RabbidLuigi for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Share your talent with the world with Squarespace today.